Capital One, ladies and gentlemen, is buying Discover. Now, there's a couple different things that we got to hit upon. A, we want to talk about how this affects consumers. B, we want to talk about the details of the deal. And then C, we want to talk about synergies. Now, if you've been on Millionaire Morning Show, and for any length of time, then you know that we talk about synergies. And what does synergies mean? Synergies mean when you combine a company or when a company buys out another company and then they merge assets and acquisitions and all of that stuff. Who is it that we eliminate? Who's getting laid off? Who's getting laid off for this acquisition that's happening with Capital One buying Discover? Make sure you hit a like for the algorithm, subscribe to the channel, and then turn on your notifications. Let's deep dive into this a little bit, ladies and gentlemen.
In this country, two of the biggest credit card companies, Capital One and Discover Financial, have agreed to merge in a $35 billion deal. If it goes through, it could have big implications for consumers. Jolene Kent has more. Jolene, good morning. So explain to me, what's the likely impact on credit card users?
Vlad, good morning. Credit card users, for now, we're not going to see any big changes, but some consumer advocates are saying this deal is concerning because it will result in more consolidation in the banking and credit card industries, which could mean less choice down the road for consumers. Now, Capital One is one of the larger banks and credit card companies in the U.S., and Discover is one of 4 major credit card players, but it's the smallest among Visa, MasterCard, and American Express. Now, Capital One, of course, stands to benefit a lot from this deal, given that Americans right now are using credit cards more than ever before.
Michael Anderson, I am going to cover this in Stock Club. That's the very next thing that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Visa, MasterCard, obviously American Express, which one is the best one to invest in, financials, banks. That's the next thing that we're going into. We've covered the Magnificent Seven inside of Stock Club, which is, well, I'm not going to go into the details of what it is, because if you're in the Patreon and the Bag Chasers and you watch the video, then you know it. We've also covered the hospitality industry. A couple days ago, we covered energy drinks. We've covered healthcare. Well, we haven't covered healthcare yet. We've covered hospitality with regard to hotels. We've covered airlines. The other day, we covered energy drinks and trash, right? Disposable services, waste management, Republic Services. And then now we're going to get into the finance industry on the next Stock Club. So I can't wait to cover it. But we got to wait for some things to come out because we don't even know if this deal is going to go through yet. But let me continue to play the video real quick.
Credit card debt is at record highs. It's currently sitting at over $1 trillion. And on top of that, the average interest rate on a bank credit card is roughly 21.5%. That's the highest it's been since the Federal Reserve began tracking this nearly 30 years ago. So while that's good news for the credit card companies, it's a big question mark for consumers, right? Capital One CEO, however, Richard Fairbank, said in a statement late last night that Capital One and Discover could more aggressively compete against those larger credit card companies once they're a combined company. But of course, before anything can happen, this deal has to be approved by regulators, and you can bet it's going to receive significant antitrust scrutiny from the feds. Capital One hoping to close this deal at the end of the year or early next. Jerika.
So some of the things that they're not telling you and some of the things that, you're not necessarily having a conversation about is the details of the deal, and it's going to take a while for them to even be able to pull this deal off, if they're able to pull a deal off at all, because antitrust regulators want to make sure that they're not putting together a monopoly that would then obviously prevent competitors from being able to compete in the same space as them. Obviously, their competitors are American Express, Visa, MasterCard. Capital One has largely been seen as a premier lender. Amongst this is debt is exploding, right? And we know that we have some of the highest interest rates of all time, meaning that you guys are looked at as a commodity. You guys are looked at as an opportunity from these companies. When they see you and they see your credit score, and we know that debt is exploding, right? It recently crossed the $1 trillion mark within the last few months. It's already at $1.6 trillion in credit card debt. Let me say that again. $1.6 trillion. It went from $1 trillion to almost $1.6 trillion in consumer debt, meaning that people are paying more interest than ever before to these credit card companies. And then the default rates are up also, which means that it creates a subprime market in which you pay even more interest to have the same services or to do some of the same things that you was doing previously when you couldn't afford it. So when I see people say stuff like, oh man, what's your credit score? All that tells me is that you're looking for somebody to be able to finance something that they shouldn't have in the first place, because we should not be leveraging credit in order to justify our lifestyle. But you then become a commodity. You then become an asset to these credit card companies, because when they see that you're paying your bills on time, they don't see somebody that they want to do business with. They see somebody that they can take finances and resources from. You wind up paying exponentially more for the same goods and services that you choose to use a credit card for, but you get roped in with the points and the fees and all of this other stuff. And so if it's such a good idea, then why is credit card debt exploding for people that shouldn't have them in the first place? If building your credit the way that it's being sold to you is such a great idea, then why are they willing to spend so much money to acquire Discover if it wasn't an asset, or to acquire their customer base, in which Discover is actually the smallest of the four. Discover is the smallest of the four, but they're spending a significant amount of money in an all-stock deal to acquire Discover, in which their stock absolutely exploded as a result of it. Let's continue to go on, and then I'm gonna dive a little bit into how the people are going to be affected that works for Capital One and Discover.
My apologies. They came out with a note saying that it would probably be difficult to get this deal approved given the regulatory environment.
I actually think so. I don't cover Capital One and DFS, but I actually think they have a good case, because what they're doing is they're widening the offering for credit cards and debit cards. So they could actually make a good case for regulators saying, hey, we're leveling the playing field. So again,
So you don't have the same regulatory concerns. I mean, listen, it's the White House that has said they're worried about antitrust, mostly on the tech side, Amazon and some others. You think this, and I know again we're just spitballing.
of course,
here, that this does have a chance to get through the regulatory regime.
I think so, because I do think, and again, I from a Visa MasterCard perspective, this could be if it's Visa MasterCard's pain, it's Capital One's a regulatory gain, because if you think about the regulator has gone against like Visa in the past. So if anything that kind of is a drag on Visa, the regulator would say, hey, this is a great thing.
And the credit card space is confusing, at least to me, and I'm guessing many of our viewers, Dan, in a sense that Capital One and Discover are very different than MasterCard and Visa, correct? Because Capital One is actually a bank that runs its processing through.
Always doing too much. Somebody time out Giovanni. One of the mods, time out Giovanni, please. Just doing too much.
MasterCard or Visa. Discover kind of has its own thing. They are separate. You see the stickers on the door.
Correct.
Right? What would this deal create? Would it create effectively sort of another American Express?
Exactly. Like you hit the nail on the head, right? So what we think
I read your note.
Thank you. It's not as good as Ray J, but it's no.
Getting old.
So look, they're really, in my view, again, they're trying to create a small Amex, right? It's called a closed loop system, where you basically you have the relationship with the merchant.
And no, you can't even get up to my floor unless I authorize you to be able to come up here. So you got to have security access to even get up to my floor. It's not the same. You know what I'm saying? Like, come on, listen. We're not worried about none of that. Let's just focus on Amex and Visa and MasterCard and Discover and Capital One, guys. Let's not focus on that.
And with the consumer, so you can determine interchange.
Yeah.
You can benefit more from the interchange. And also there's about $300 billion of U.S. credit that goes through Capital One, and they can steer. $300 billion. It's about 10% of the combined Visa MasterCard credit volumes per year.
Does this hurt Visa? Because if you're saying closed loop, Discover is its own thing.
Correct.
And they've had a lot of problems, accounting issues and whatever. If Capital One does this deal, do they then dump processing through MasterCard and or Visa and just kind of build their own thing?
Not overnight, but over time.
That's clearly seems to be the goal.
So one of the goals of them acquiring them is not just acquiring a customer base, not just acquiring people that they can make money from interest, but their processing fees of having to process things through MasterCard and Visa. Ultimately, they'll be able to build a different platform that will save them a significant amount of money in all of the fees that they have to charge for processing transactions through Visa and MasterCard by doing it through Discovery over a period of time, right? So there's significant upside and opportunities in addition to acquiring a customer base. But see, here's the thing that you really want to pay attention to right now. And this is the thing that I want people to really focus on when these companies acquire other companies. There's other reasons that they then acquire other companies because they can take the profits and the revenue that they're generating, but also they can offset some of the costs, and they might even be able to pass it on to the other company depending on how it is that they structure their workforce. Check this out.
On the outside looking in, it appears business as usual at Discover Financial Services headquarters in suburban Riverwoods. But this morning, executives from Capital One joined Discover CEO Michael Rhodes for a conference call to officially acknowledge the framework of a massive acquisition.
Among American businesses, these are big players. And anytime you have these companies of this size come together, it's a significant thing.
Capital One serves more than 100 million customers. The mega merger now giving the company access to Discover's 305 million cardholders and the mostly untapped potential of Discover's payment network.
Discover is kind of unique in the credit card space. They are also a credit card network, meaning they're the ones who help process the transaction when you swipe that card.
So they're basically buying their credit network, their processing network. That's beautiful. They seen that they was the smallest player in the credit card space. They didn't necessarily need MasterCard or Visa in order to acquire, their customer base. They get the customer base as a result of it also, and the marketing and the perspective of how it is that you look at Discover and discover it, but they're buying their processing network. They don't care about your employees. They don't care about, the IT department. They don't care about any of that. They buy in their processing network. When these companies acquire other companies, a lot of times, don't just look at it as, they merging and they're going to be bigger and they're trying to get a monopoly. No, they're trying to stifle the competition, prevent themselves from having to give more money over into people, and then keep more money in-house, which will then benefit their shareholders. When we look at this, sometimes we have to look at this and say, how does this benefit shareholders? Because I'm a huge fan of Visa. I'm a huge fan of MasterCard from an investment point of view. But now we have to start looking at Capital One differently. When we evaluate this and we go over in Stock Club, we're going to look at default rates. We're going to look at the quality of their customers. We're going to look at how many customers, how this is going to affect Visa and MasterCard. We're going to deep dive into it. But more importantly, we're going to look at how much money Capital One saves by acquiring Discover. And how does this affect their customers and their workers, which will also benefit the shareholders, okay?
What does the deal mean for the more than 5,000 Discover employees who call the Chicago area home? Discover CEO
Shout out to Chicago. Y'all keep taking these L's too.
Michael Rhodes was mostly quiet on today's conference call, only thanking Discover employees for their hard work and saying they intend to remain committed to the Chicago area.
They're quiet because they're not telling you. If you work for Discover and you are over in Chicago, all right? If you work for Discover and you over in Chicago, because most of these companies don't like Chicago anymore. But if you work for Discover, right, and you're over in Chicago, don't wait for them to lay you off. You need to get your resume together. You need to get your LinkedIn together, and you need to be getting a coaching call from Anton Daniels in order to market yourself to another company. Don't wait for them to get rid of you. Prepare yourself. Prepare yourself. If you think that they still need you when they say that we're dedicated to the Chicago area, that means that they're dedicated to the real estate that they own over in the Chicago area. They're not dedicated to you. You need to be looking at getting your resume together and not sitting there waiting on them to let you go, because they're not going to need your HR department. They're not going, over a period of time, they're going to get rid of all of y'all, either by natural attrition or through layoffs, because they do not need to duplicate the process. It's called redundancies.
It will be interesting to see, because there will be a fair amount of overlap between these two giant companies.
What is overlap? Redundancy. That means that you doing the same thing that we doing over here, and we don't really need y'all, and so we can save money by removing y'all and still acquiring y'all customer base and y'all payment processing systems. They don't need, overlap is redundant. That means layoffs. They're not giving away money for the sake of giving away money. They got a board and they got shareholders to answer to. It's layoffs. When you hear them say this lingo, oh my God, we got a fair amount of overlap and all of this stuff, that's called layoffs.
Capital One executives did say they plan to keep Discover's branding, noting Discover's loyal customer base and high consumer satisfaction. As for cardholders of the two companies, nothing will change until the deal goes through, which could happen as soon as later this year.
They're going to keep your branding, though.
And any changes in the terms of your card must be communicated 45 days in advance.
None of that matters. The only thing that matters is whether you're going to still have a job, what your interest rates are, and whether or not they can cut out some of the fees that they got to get over to the other credit card processing companies because they forced to do business with them. But they want to expand their network and prevent themselves from giving over other monies that they shouldn't have to give over into these processors. So we're going to deep dive into that in Stock Club.